Okay, well, most of the speakers we have at Forum are people that we find outside the church, but it is my great pleasure to have an actual member of our church who is an expert on the topic of the death penalty and specifically abolishing it. I personally feel that this is very important. So many people are put to death that really weren't guilty of the crime, and there's a lot of circumstances that lead to that happening, which Bob will probably speak about in a moment. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Bob Bacon to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here to speak about a cause that I have devoted now 34 years of my professional life to. And the good news, as it says on the screen, the death penalty is dying. It is in major decline. That's true internationally, it's true nationally, and it's true here in California. It will not die of its own. It needs to be pushed over the edge by activists. I'll begin with a bit of the national picture, then a short interlude about the federal death penalty, and then conclude by speaking about the situation here in California and leave time for questions at the end. Nationally, there are about 30 new death sentences imposed in each year. That is a 90% decline since the turn of the century. Nationally, there are between 20 and 30 executions in any year. That is a decline of 70% since the turn of the century. To put those numbers in perspective, they are far less than 1% of the number of first-degree murders that occur in this country in any one year. This is a tool that is used at enormous and wasteful political cost in just a minuscule percentage of the cases. Slide number 2. 11 indicate there 27 states have the death penalty on the books, 23 do not. I'll say in a moment more that that's kind of a half-truth. Important thing is that 11 states have abolished the death penalty in this century, and there has been no trend in the opposite direction. No state that did not have it has adopted it during that time. On the back table, there's a list with the list of the states on the honor roll without the death penalty, and states like California that have it on the books but use it less and less. Of those 27 states, only a handful actually impose new death sentences, far less than the 27. Within those states, only a handful of counties actually impose new death sentences. They tend not to be the counties with the most murders. They tend not to be the counties with the worst murders. It's a matter of culture and local politics. And as the number of death penalty prosecutions, the number of death sentences declines, is not focusing in on a subset of defendants who are the worst of the worst. It's just focusing in on a subset of the low-hanging fruit, particularly the seriously mentally ill, or more and more, larger and larger proportion of the small number of people that are sentenced to death. Slide 3. Back up one. There we are. Executions are conducted even in a smaller handful of states than death sentences are imposed. California is one of 12 states that has the death penalty on the books, but has not conducted an execution in more than 10 years. Slide 4. These are the states where the vast majority of executions occur in the 4 states on this list in the current decade. Internationally, with one exception, every country that we would wish to be compared with has abolished the death penalty quite a number of years ago. Japan is the only industrial democracy other than the US that maintains the death penalty. Like the United States, it doesn't use it very often. Only one European country retains the death penalty, and that is Belarus. Several Western Hemisphere countries have the death penalty on the books, including Cuba. But over the last several years, the United States has been the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has actually conducted executions. It's been true for a number of years. This is an issue that is less partisan than many other issues, although like everything else in this country, it has become more partisan in the last decade. Death penalty was not a significant political issue in the 2024 campaign, even though other issues relating to crime were. No longer has the salience of a political issue that it once did. Public opinion data shows that support for the death penalty is declining very slowly. The trend is quite slow, but the trend is also quite steady over many years. Support for the death penalty is age correlated. The younger you are, the more likely you are to oppose the death penalty. You can read the percentage numbers that you read often vary greatly. You can get quite different numbers by asking the question in different ways. If you ask the question in a way that introduces the concept of life in prison without parole and the concept of work in prison with restitution to the victim's family, you can cause the support number to go down and the opposition number to go up. Most religious organizations oppose the death penalty and have for many years. But paradoxically, people who claim no religion are more likely to oppose the death penalty than people who claim a religious faith. There is some amount of disconnect between denominational policy and the people in the pews. The Roman Catholic hierarchy speak of a seamless garment ethic of life. They oppose abortion and they oppose the death penalty for the same reasons, as violation of the same ethic. But among Protestants, they're not connected in that way. Protestants who oppose abortion are more likely to support the death penalty and the other way around. The number of people with religious or moral objections to the death penalty is not large enough to shape public policy on its own, although we have a considerable influence. But there's so many reasons for people to oppose the death penalty, even if they have no religious or moral or ethical objections to it. The institutions that impose the death penalty, like all human institutions, are fallible. We have confirmed in the last half century a total of 200 people who were sentenced to death whose guilt could not be proven, even though 12 jurors out of 12 found them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And those same 12 jurors out of 12 imposed a death sentence, and further investigation has convinced the appropriate authorities that those people should not have been convicted, much less sentenced to death. And the lack of resources for investigating or confirming such injustices strongly suggests that the number is considerably higher than that, and that innocent people have been executed in this country. Some of the strongest voices against the death penalty are survivors who have lost a family member to homicide, for whom death penalty litigation has kept their tragedy in the public eye for decades, delayed healing, kept wounds open, made them vulnerable to television news crews showing up years and years after the fact and asking them to talk publicly about the worst thing that ever happened in their lives. Death penalty litigation makes the defendant a celebrity. People serving life in prison, for better and for worse, are simply forgotten, allowing the survivors to move on. Slide number 5. The link from slavery to lynching to Jim Crow to mass incarceration to the death penalty is not only very direct, it is very strong. Next slide. Brian Stevenson, one of this generation's version of the Hebrew prophets, author of the best-selling and award-winning Just Mercy. He began his career representing people under sentence of death, and the publicity and the resources that came to him and to his organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, as a result of that book, has allowed his organization to expand their focus to teach us American history that we didn't learn in school, that's so important to helping us understand how we got to where we are, which we need to know if we want to find our way to somewhere else. The race of victim effect is much stronger in death penalty litigation than the race of defendant effect. That's another way of saying that most people who are sentenced to death are sentenced to death for the murder of a white person. This is so even though the risk of death by homicide is like most bad things in this society. It is a risk that falls most heavily on people of color. Those are not the cases that typically are prosecuted as death sentence, as capitally, or in which death sentences are sought or obtained. Next slide. These are not the total death sentences. They're just the executions. These are the numbers for the first 11 months of this year. The proportions would be virtually the same in any of the last 10 years. It's counterintuitive, but the financial cost of death penalty litigation is enormous, far above and beyond the cost of keeping a person in prison for life. The defendant's entire life is at issue in the penalty phase of a capital trial, not just the immediate circumstances of the crime. It involves, if done well, high-order lawyering, high-order investigation, high-order expertise. More and more fiscal conservatives are asking why we spend this inordinate amount of money on such a small proportion of the criminal cases, rather than, as someone put it, spending the money instead to actually do something about crime. Similarly, more and more libertarians realize that the death penalty is a big government program that costs a lot of money and doesn't work. People who are unsure of the government's ability to decide when to fill the potholes are often unsure of the government's ability to decide who to kill and who not to. Something else that's counterintuitive is that the presence or absence of the death penalty has no measurable deterrent effect on crime, on commission of homicides. colleague of mine said the problem with those deterrence models is that the people doing the thinking and the people doing the killing are not the same people. The prevalence of the death penalty is correlated with high murder rates. Neither one causes the other. They are both effects of similar cultural and political causes in various parts of the country. Next slide. Issues concerning the method of execution have created revulsion against the death penalty over the last couple of decades. Most states conduct executions with a massive overdose of either a sedative or anesthetic agent. Legitimate manufacturers of pharmaceuticals, for understandable reasons, do not allow their products to be used to deliberately kill other people. That is not good public relations for an organization in the medical industry. This has led states that conduct executions to two things. One is secrecy and the other one is recklessness. Next slide. Less is known about the manner in which states procure execution drugs than about any other kind of public contracting. States obtain questionable chemicals from questionable sources. There are well-established national and international prohibitions on uncontrolled human subject medical experimentation in general and on prisoners in particular, and many executing states skate very close to the line in terms of those international and national norms. Several states have adopted execution by nitrogen, by breathing pure nitrogen without oxygen. Alabama is the only state that has tried it. It has proven equally torturous with all other methods of execution. Standards of veterinary practice prohibit the use of nitrogen for euthanasia of mammals. It is a crime in the state of California to kill either a cat or a dog by using nitrogen. That is a quick look at the lay of the landscape nationally, where we are with the death penalty, some of the reasons that we got there, some of the reasons that we're moving in the right direction. Next slide. I'll take a brief interlude to talk about the federal death penalty. There are 40 individuals under death sentence imposed in a federal court. This is about 2% of the national total. The federal death penalty was probably adopted with specific national concerns in mind, such as international terrorism or national security crimes. That is not the way that it's been used. Only one or two of those 40 individuals was sentenced for a crime of that nature. Mostly they're the same kinds of cases that are tried in state courts. Some of them tried federally because the local prosecutors were not interested in seeking the death penalty in a particularly high-profile case. President Biden's administration sought many fewer new death sentences than prior administrations, not zero, but very few. They have, however, very vigorously defended the death sentences imposed by prior administrations. President Trump, in the last 6 months of his first term, saw to 13 federal executions. This is about the same number in 6 months that had occurred in the previous 80 years. He made clear that he intends to pick up where he left off. President Biden has the unilateral power to prevent that. He has the power of clemency to commute each of these sentences to life without parole, which case the defendants would be forever immune from execution. Go to www.commutetherow.com. You can add your name and get ideas of ways that you can be involved in this campaign in the remaining weeks of President Biden's term. Whatever action he does take is probably not be known until mid-January, but the effort needs to be made now. I'll talk a little bit more about universal clemency as I switch to talking a little bit about situation here in California. Slide 11. California has about the same number of prisoners under death sentence as the next three states. Next slide. But it imposes almost no new death sentences. Actually, there's an error on this slide. San Bernardino County has imposed 3 new death sentences in 5 years, not 4. And the total in all the other counties is 4, not 3. But even so, most Californians live in counties where the district attorney never seeks the death penalty. Riverside County has for many years imposed a disproportionate share of the total number of death sentences imposed in the nation. It doesn't have a particularly higher murder rate than any other urban county. Comparing that small number of new death sentences and the large number of people under death sentence means several things. It means that most of the people who are under a California death sentence, if an identical case came into the district attorney's office today, the death penalty would not be sought. Means this is an elderly population. It is among the less dangerous components of the prison population. People in prison, just like people on the outside, mellow out as they move into middle age and old age. Next month, California will have gone 19 years without an execution. Very early in Governor Newsom's term, he would, said he would not permit an execution so long as he as long as he was in office. Most, but not all, of the serious candidates for governor in 2026 have made clear that they intend to carry out the same policy, and all, as the campaign heats up, all should be encouraged to do so. We don't carry out executions. We impose very few new death sentences, but we waste enormous amounts of public money litigating capital cases. Thank you very much. Waste enormous amounts of money with no net gain in public safety. This is an ongoing financial obligation that Riverside County foists onto the rest of the state. The cost of the capital trial is comparatively small percentage of the total. It's especially small in a county like Riverside where they do it on the cheap. But the cost post-conviction litigation over decades will dwarf the amount that was spent on the trial. And those are the responsibilities of all of us, the taxpayers of California as a whole. Attorney General Rob Bonta, like his 4 predecessors, is personally opposed to the death penalty, but he allows his deputies to vigorously defend death sentences that are imposed in the Riversides and Tullares of the state. defend them almost on a knee-jerk basis, even opposing claims based on racial discrimination in jury selection, which is rampant in this state and not just in the Riversides and the Tullares, allows them to advance picayune procedural grounds to avoid consideration of the merits of challenges to murder convictions and death sentences, wasting again money that could be spent doing something about crime. Governor Newsom, a couple of years ago, instituted the transfer of death sentence prisoners to the main line. The old maximum security death row cell block at San Quentin was shut down, and these prisoners were moved to facilities around the state appropriate to their personal circumstances, in recognition that they are not the worst of the worst. They're just like other prisoners serving long sentences for violent crimes and deserve to be treated the same way. This gives them more programming opportunities, more work opportunities, more educational opportunities, more freedom to move around within the confines of the institution. And as Governor Newsom hoped, diffuses arguments that we need the death penalty for this select and unusual group. You back up one slide. Say here that in the last few months, the number of people under California death sentences declined substantially. The largest factor in this is prosecutor-initiated resentencings, agreed dispositions to set aside a death sentence and resentence the person either to life without parole or to a sentence that allows them to apply to the parole board, depending on the circumstances of the case. There have been quite a number of these. Sadly, the easy ones are now done, so the speed of that process is not likely to continue. The defeat of progressive prosecutors in Alameda and Los Angeles County was due to other reasons. It was not due to prosecutor-initiated resentencings of very old cases that leave middle-aged and elderly men in prison. Legislature in the last few years has passed a variety of what are sometimes called second look statutes, such as the prosecutor-initiated resentencing that allow courts to take a second look at very long sentences imposed a long time ago, in recognition that there's a lot of people who probably needed to be in prison 30 years ago that probably don't need to be there today. Implementation of these statutes has been slow and steady. There hasn't been enough money to investigate all the cases where they could profitably be used. Most of the cases involved are life sentences. There are some death sentences that are can potentially be set aside under these statutes. Legislators should continue to be encouraged. There's many more options for ways that second looks can be offered without endangering public safety. Slide number 13. Just as President Biden is being encouraged to commute all federal death sentences, Governor Newsom should be encouraged to commute all California death sentences. We know he is interested. He talks about it. People close to him talk to him about it. He has not committed to it. He doesn't know quite how he would make it happen. He hopes that a way can be found. An important part of that, he needs to know that he has public support up front, and he needs to know that the public support would remain and would be there for him after he took this step. It's not unusual. It occurred 2 years ago in the state of Oregon. It's occurred in a number of other states, including New Mexico and Illinois. Go to clemencyca.org, add your name, sign up for information about what you can do in the coming months to make this happen. Governor Newsom has 2 more years in his term, but he cannot wait a full 2 years. We know that because in the last few years, termed out governors in Louisiana and Nevada were known to be interested in universal clemency, but they started too late and their opponents were able to run out the clock and they were not able to succeed. So the campaign is underway now. Next slide. Put on the back table a flyer about an event that will occur next Sunday afternoon just down the hill here at the War Memorial. You can come to the UUSF Holiday Fair and then walk down the hill to hear from some international speakers. An event scheduled around International Human Rights Day to encourage the campaign for Governor Newsom to grant universal clemency. Again, there are copies of this flyer on the back table. One very unusual twist in California, unique among the states. President Biden and most state governors can grant clemency, can commute sentences on their own. The governor of California can, but only for people who have been convicted of a felony only on a single occasion. For people who have been convicted of a felony on 2 or more separate occasions, the governor must obtain the consent of the California Supreme Court before granting clemency. Among the prisoners on California death sentences, about 1/3 are in the single conviction category that the governor could commute on his own. About 2/3 would require the consent of the Supreme Court. Governor Newsom very regularly asks the California Supreme Court for permission to grant clemency in non-capital cases, most typically someone serving life without parole to be commuted to a sentence that allows them to apply to the parole board. The California Supreme Court generally grants these requests from the governor, not exercising its independent judgment, but testing whether the governor's proposal appears to be an abuse of discretion or an abuse of power deferentially to the governor. I have the privilege to be part of a multi-agency team, and Orangers, you will be pleased to know the ACLU of Northern California, one of the agencies on this powerful multi-agency team that is presenting the California Supreme Court with powerful statistics showing the racial bias at every stage of the California death penalty process based on high-end analysis of data about thousands of cases across decades, presenting this to the court in the abstract, not limited to the circumstances of any one defendant in any one murder. The court hasn't decided what they will do with this case yet. The Supreme Court of the state of Washington in 2018 abolished that state's death penalty based upon a very similar factual showing, a very similar campaign. Here in San Francisco, no district attorney has sought a death penalty in many years. District Attorney Brooke Jenkins has not committed absolutely that she will not do so, unlike some of her predecessors. She should be encouraged to do so, to be on record before there is a high-profile murder of a police officer in which pressure is placed on her. She has a very good role model. One of her predecessors, Kamala Harris, took that pledge at the time she became district attorney, and very early in her term was confronted with the murder of a police officer and strong political and media pressure to bend, and to her credit, she refused to do so. Ms. Jenkins should be encouraged to do likewise. California is almost unique among the states that the California legislature cannot abolish the death penalty. The California legislature cannot amend or repeal statutes adopted by initiative. California's death penalty statute was adopted by initiative in 1978. Initiatives to abolish the death penalty very narrowly failed in 2012 and 2016. Some of you were involved in Yes on 34 and Yes on 62. The polling numbers suggest that not much has changed since then, that another attempt would probably be a crapshoot like the last two. The good news is that the moratorium on executions, the chipping away at the death penalty one prisoner at a time, means that it is not urgent to go back to the voters and take a third try at abolition of the death penalty. When we abolish it, whether it's all at once or one prisoner at a time, we have to keep it abolished. California abolished the death penalty in 1972, and it didn't stay abolished for very long. The odds are a lot better in this decade than they were in the 1970s. There's death penalty is simply less important in California culture. Not many people would miss the death penalty if it weren't here. The few who would are very loud. They're loud out of proportion to their numbers. And it shouldn't be difficult to put on the defensive people who want to keep the death penalty. Just tell me why you want to waste California tax dollars to make California more like Alabama when we're making ourselves the anti-Trump state and differentiating ourselves from Alabama, from Texas, from Oklahoma in so many other ways. What can you do? Go to commutetherow.com, go to clemencyca.org, talk up the issue in the other circles in which you travel. Support your legislators when they support criminal justice reform statutes. Last slide. If you want to know lots and lots about the death penalty, the Death Penalty Information Center is a highly professional, highly respected organization that receives a great deal of foundation support, that is relied upon by journalists, by teachers, by students, by public officials, by folks like us. Be glad if we have a few minutes left for questions.
Yes, we already have some questions from the audience, and I realized that I neglected to mention in my introduction of Bob that he is a highly respected capital punishment attorney, an appellate attorney. So he is an expert on this topic, in case that engenders any questions that you might have wanted to ask him. Okay, here's a question from the audience. How do U.S. death penalty stats compare with social democracies in Europe? What about England? Okay, I'll ask the question again. I may not have spoken loudly enough. So the question was about how death penalty stats in the US compare to those of democracies in Western Europe, and in particular, they asked about England.
England abolished the death penalty by statute, I believe, in 1965, give or take a year. France was probably one of the last holdouts among the Western European countries, had it until about 1980. It was very quickly abolished in Eastern European countries as soon as they shed their communist governments. It was abolished very quickly in countries like Spain, Portugal, and South Africa when they shed their right-wing dictatorial governments. So the stats are that European social democracies do not have the death penalty, and the numbers are zero and have been for decades.
Thank you. What criteria do prosecutors use to decide whether to ask for the death penalty?
There's as many answers to that as there are prosecutors. The criteria in the statutes under which death penalty can be sought are so broad that virtually any murder case could be brought within them, so they don't significantly guide the discretion of either the prosecutor or the jury. It is a political decision in the best and the worst sense of that word by an elected official. Prosecutorial discretion is conferred upon elected officials at the local level, a very deliberate choice in this country over centuries, for better and for worse. The scope of media attention, the race of the victim, the amount of blood, the goriness of the photographs, they all can play a part.
We have a question about China specifically. I believe China executes more people than any other country in the world by a wide margin. Can you talk about other countries outside of the West?
You are right that China executes more people than any other country in the world by a wide margin, and they do not tell the world how many they execute. That there's an among the countries where we have a good idea of how many executions there are. Two that stand out are Iran and Saudi Arabia. They conduct executions for murders and rapes and that kind of crimes. They also conduct executions of political dissidents. Executions for blasphemy are always a possibility in a number of nations. I don't know how often they actually occur, but that is the company that the United States keeps in retaining the death penalty.
So, Bob, you've spoken about how support for the death penalty is declining, that the surveys and trends seem to tell us that. Yet, do you think that Governor Newsom, in his reluctance to really get behind abolishing the death penalty, is that because of his national ambitions? And so he feels like the population at large is supportive of the death penalty. How does that square with the idea that the death penalty is dying?
I would disagree with the premise of Governor Newsom's reluctance to get behind opposition to the death penalty. I don't think that is an accurate description of what he's said or what he's done. Reasonable political advisors can and do differ about the appropriateness of universal clemency in connection with his national political ambitions. Not all informed political advisors see that issue the same way. Let us back up to a time when it was political poison for any person with political ambitions beyond the city and county of San Francisco to support same-sex marriage. And newly elected Mayor Gavin Newsom was smarter than the rest of us. He realized that by the time he fulfilled his ambitions on a larger scale than the city of San Francisco, it would be perceived as an asset. It would be perceived to his advantage that he had been out front on this issue before other folks were ready to take it on. He's been there before, and it worked.
Thank you. I think you're right. We just had a question from the chat on Zoom asking you to speak a little bit more about your background, how you came to this issue, and things like that.
Okay, this is my third career. After I graduated from college, from law school, I detoured for a number of years into court management. Then I spent several years representing the prosecution in criminal appeals. And so I learned about this happening in a state that does not have the death penalty, and learning about some of the people working against the death penalty, representing people under sentence of death around the country. They were some of the most inspiring people that I knew. Man named Steve Bright, the Pied Piper of public interest law, who was Brian Stevenson's mentor. I never worked for Brian. I crossed paths with him, and Brian never told, not Brian, Steve never told me that I should be one of the people doing this. He waited for me to figure it out for myself. And in 1989, I decided to try it for 2 years. Here I am.
Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Under what conditions can the federal government impose the death penalty when state prosecutors refuse to seek one?
Whenever they think they can get it, seriatim state and federal prosecutions for the same crime, oddly enough, do not implicate the federal Constitution's prohibition on double jeopardy. There was a man who was sentenced to death in a federal court in Oklahoma after the state court jury in Oklahoma decided his crime wasn't murder, but was manslaughter, for which a shorter term of years was appropriate. The federal prosecutors didn't think that that was a just result and sought the death penalty. There is a former enlisted man in the military service who is under a federal death sentence for 3 murders for which he was acquitted by a jury in a state court in North Carolina. In a few cities such as St. Louis, Atlanta, and Richmond, Virginia, the jury pool in state court is selected from a small area that is predominantly Black, and the jury pool in the federal district is from a larger, more diverse pool, and federal prosecutors are known to seek death penalty in those particular areas on the theory that they're much more likely to get it from a less Black jury.
I see. Are there any new arguments for retaining the death penalty?
I haven't heard any for quite a while. The folks we usually hear from tend not to be all that creative. Losing a loved one to homicide is one of the absolute worst things that can ever happen to anyone. Fortunately, it's never happened to me. I know about losing a loved one in a plane crash, and that's bad enough. Uh, and the emotional response is absolutely understandable. And the response to the media, it's absolutely understandable. And sadly, families are newly in that situation every day. And the death penalty process continues to inflict the same harm on those families, but they don't realize it yet. Some prosecutors believe it is to their political advantage to exploit the suffering of these families. It still works in Riverside and Tulare counties. It works in fewer and fewer counties around the country every year. So the arguments in favor of the death penalty, I think, are the same ones over and over again.
Are you aware of any judges or prosecutors that have stated public regret for a death penalty that was carried out once exculpatory evidence was introduced? I think there have been a few cases like that, haven't there? I'm not sure.
Yes, yes, it does happen, and uh, retired prosecutors, retired judges, not infrequently are persuaded that a conviction or at a minimum a death sentence was inappropriate, and uh, although they acted in the utmost good faith, doing their best with the information that was known to them, they now realize, with the benefit of additional investigation and the benefit of hindsight, that a mistake has been made. Sadly, that does continue to happen. Sometimes they're successful in having death sentences set aside. Sometimes they're not. There was an execution in Missouri earlier this year over the strong objection of the prosecutor who had been involved in that case. Um, to her credit, outgoing District Attorney Pamela Price of Alameda County has owned up to serious misconduct on the part of her predecessors and some of her deputies in racially biased jury selection in capital cases, and has conceded that death sentences and some convictions needed to be set aside.
Thank you. Have any studies been done on persons condemned to death for murder, whether they're terrible crimes or whether they were diagnosed as mentally disturbed and saved from the death penalty because of that, because of their mental state or condition?
Uh, the proportion of serious mental illness among people who commit homicides is enormous. The proportion of developmental disabilities is very high. Highest of all is exposure to serious long-term child abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional. These define a large share of the population against whom the death penalty is sought. Developing the life histories and the stories that come out of these experiences is the centerpiece of successful litigation on behalf of a person against whom the death penalty is sought, and failure to discover that, even though it's there, leads to a significant percentage of the death sentences that are imposed.
What is the legal process necessary to abolish the death penalty throughout the United States, and what are the prospects of that ever occurring?
As I said, most states, the legislature can abolish the death penalty, unlike California. It's happened 7 or 8, 9 states in this century. A couple of states' Supreme Courts have abolished the death penalty. We don't. There's 4 or 5 states where, in fairly recent years, one house of the state legislature has had voted to abolish the death penalty, but the bill hasn't gone all the way through. For many decades, the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment in light of what late Chief Justice Warren referred to as the evolving standards of decency of a maturing society, a line of reasoning that if followed through would lead to the eventual abolition of the death penalty as it is used less and less, fewer and fewer places. Unfortunately, there is reason to believe that within the next few years, the U.S. Supreme Court is fairly likely to abandon that view of the Eighth Amendment, and as it has with so many other prohibitions of the federal Constitution, hold that the ban on cruel and unusual punishments is static and speaks as of 1791, when the death penalty was clearly an important part of the legal system. So that does not, in this generation, appear a realistic option, but state by state abolition is likely to continue in the next 25 years as it has in the last 25.
Let's hope. Okay. The last question is really more of an announcement. So on the Zoom call, we have Gabriela. She's an activist with Amnesty International, and AIUSA, of course, is a big proponent of abolishing the death penalty. And
Hello, Gabriela.
You know Gabriela, of course.
Yes.
Yes. She mentioned, I saw her on the street a couple of days ago, and she said that she was going to be attending your talk.
Thanks for stopping by.
So when I saw her the other day, she talked about how the president always pardons turkeys for Thanksgiving, which I assume happened this year. That's nice, isn't it? But it'd be nice to pardon some people too, or commute their sentences anyway. So this is what Amnesty International is asking President Biden to do while he still is in office. And if you support these things, I think you could visit their website and find links to click that you could support these requests. They request that the federal government commute all federal death penalty cases in military row, free Leonard Peltier, who is now quite elderly and I believe dying and of no danger to anyone. So please pardon this man or commute his sentence, really. Force a ceasefire in Gaza and stop arms shipments to Israel, restore access to asylum at the border, and finally to protect communities from mass deportation, which sadly we may be seeing pretty soon. So, okay. Any other questions from the audience before we thank Bob?
Thank you all for attention and excellent questions. And again, www.commutetherow.com and clemencyca.org.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. That concludes Forum to today, and our next scheduled forum is on January 19th. Thank you.